Defining problems and formulating questions are important initial steps prior to gathering evidence or acquiring data. And if you think about it from the perspective of the Human Resource Analytics project lifecycle, which you see pictured here, when we're talking about defining problems and formulating questions, we're really talking about this initial phase or stage of the project lifecycle, which is, of course, named question formulation. And as I mentioned, it's really important to have your question formulation and have your problem definition sorted and out of the way before you move into data acquisition, data management, and so forth and so on. Now, ultimately, what we're trying to move towards is get to that question formulation phase, where we're trying to create questions or hypotheses, which is something we're going to talk about today. But in order to get there, we should really start with adopting a strategic mindset and then using that mindset to identify and define a problem, and then ultimately moving on to formulating questions or creating hypotheses. Now, while we're going through this process and applying this framework, we want to make sure that we also engage in divergent and convergent thinking. And in the rest of this lecture, I'll get into problem definition, question formulation, and what I mean by divergent and convergent thinking processes. So we'll start with defining problems, as I mentioned. We'll move on to formulating questions. Then we'll finish up by talking about thinking divergently and convergently. And then finally, I'll show you some examples of benefits that you might achieve or realize when you engage in a rigorous problem definition and question formulation process and engage in thinking divergently and convergently in terms of your cognitive processes. So let's start with defining problems. So what is a problem? Well, a problem can be defined as a gap or a difference between the current state of affairs and a desired state of affairs. And this gap is what creates this problem. Now, then what is a problem definition? Well, a problem definition is the process of framing and diagnosing a problem, where a problem can be thought of as any challenge, opportunity, or threat, for example. Now, it's important to recognize, too, that with problem definition, we really want to frame and diagnose a problem for which finding a solution will bring some kind of value to our unit, to our organization, or a community more broad than that. So, problem definition includes describing the outcome, the context, the decision makers, key stakeholders, the scope and boundaries, as well as any constraints. Now, when identifying and defining a problem within an organization, it really is advantageous to adopt a strategic mindset. So let's break down now the problem definition components. So what are the different aspects you should engage in when it comes to defining a problem? Well, first we need a problem statement. Now, this is when you can answer the question, what problem needs to be solved here? And then frame the answer to that question as a statement. Next, you need decision makers and or stakeholders that you need to take into consideration when it comes to your problem. So in other words, you can ask yourself these questions and provide answers to them in order to determine who these decision makers are and who these key stakeholders are. So for example, who will need to make a decision or take action? Who experiences the problem either directly or indirectly? And who are the potential beneficiaries of solving the problem? Next, we need to think about the problem scope. So you might try to answer questions like, what is and is not under consideration? In other words, what are the boundaries here? What are our inclusion and exclusion criteria that we might apply? Similarly, what are the known constraints to solving this problem? And then finally, what is the time frame for selecting and implementing a solution? All of these help craft and put boundaries around what the scope is for your particular problem that you're trying to solve. Now, in terms of goals, this is the fourth component that we'll focus on in problem definition, and that is answering questions like, what is the focal target or outcome of this problem, and how will a potential solution be judged to be successful? So thinking ultimately, what is it that we're aiming for here, and how will we know if we've come up with an effective solution to this problem? So let's work through an example here of problem definition components applied to this hypothetical situation or scenario here. So in terms of problem statement, let's imagine that the problem statement is as follows. to reduce voluntary turnover among customer service representatives during their first 6 months on the job, where customer service representatives we can just abbreviate as CSRs here. Now, in terms of decision makers and stakeholders, let's imagine in this scenario that the decision makers are the VP of Human Resources as well as the Director of Human Resources, and the stakeholders of interest here are the CSRs themselves, the customer service representatives themselves, as well as customers of that organization. Now, in terms of the scope, let's imagine that the boundaries are as follows. We're only concerned about CSRs during their first 6 months on the job and only in terms of voluntary turnover. Okay? So regarding this turnover problem, we're not interested in turnover in general. We're specifically interested in voluntary turnover. So in other words, when an employee or CSR in this case decides to leave for their own reasons and not because the organization has asked or required them to leave the organization. Now, in terms of the constraints, let's also imagine that we have a $50,000 budget per year that we can have allocated towards trying to solve this problem. And then finally, in terms of the time frame for a solution, let's imagine that we want to find some kind of viable solution within the next year or so. Now, in terms of goals, the focal or target outcome here is going to be voluntary turnover, and that's been kind of implied throughout here. This is the endpoint here. We have this voluntary turnover problem apparently that we need to reduce. Now, next we need to think about, well, what's going to be our indicator of success? So how much of a reduction in voluntary turnover are we aiming for here? And so hypothetically, let's imagine in this scenario that we've defined this as being, we want a 20% reduction in voluntary turnover by 1 year after we've implemented whatever our solution entails. Okay, so this walks through, this is a somewhat generic example, but it's a hypothetical example that hopefully brings together these previous steps that I focused on right here in terms of breaking these components down and asking these questions to help flesh out each one of these aspects or each one of these components that are part of a problem definition. So now let's shift gears and let's focus on formulating questions. So after we've defined our problem, we're now ready to move on to formulating questions related to that problem. So what is question formulation? Well, it's the process of posing a question or a hypothesis to investigate why or how a problem occurs, what a problem might lead to or be associated with, or who is affected by the problem. Now, effective question formulation will contribute to the following. First, it'll help us understand the problem. 2, it'll help us identify potential solutions to that problem. 3, it'll help us identify solutions that meet the needs of decision makers and stakeholders. And it'll help us actually engage in more efficient literature searches and reviews, if that's part of our process here. And then ultimately, it can lead us to more effective storytelling as well. Now, regarding the benefits of effective question formulation and their contributions to efficient literature searches and reviews and effective storytelling, I'll actually circle back to these at the end of the lecture when I talk about the benefits of applying this framework of effective problem definition and question formulation. Okay, so now let's take a step back here and let's ask ourselves, well, what is a question? Well, you can think of a question as being a general line of inquiry regarding a problem or phenomenon of interest, okay? At least specific to this context, this is how we're defining a question here. Now, what are some examples of questions? And specifically, I'll apply this to that scenario I provided before with respect to the problem definition. Well, here's some example questions. What factors influence voluntary turnover? Okay, so in other words, what are the drivers of voluntary turnover? Does engagement predict voluntary turnover? So here it's less open-ended, and we're specifically concerned that perhaps it's engagement that is what is causing this issue with voluntary turnover, or at least influencing it, or seems to be associated with it. As a third example, how does engagement relate to voluntary turnover? So this is asking more about the process, and this might be where you start investigating different types of intermediary mechanisms, or just mediators for short, that intervene in this process between engagement and one's decision to voluntarily turn over. Now, the fourth question is which work characteristics predict voluntary turnover? And so here we're saying we're starting with a set, perhaps, of work characteristics that we've identified, and then we're trying to figure out which ones might predict voluntary turnover. And then finally, why do new employees turn over or quit in the first 6 months? And so here we're getting a little bit more specific, and we're actually adding a boundary here where we're saying in the first 6 months, why are people quitting or voluntarily turn over? And here we're focusing on new employees too. So in addition to asking questions, sometimes we might be confident enough to actually pose or frame hypotheses. And so a hypothesis is going to be a statement about the associations between two or more variables. So examples include engagement is negatively related to voluntary turnover. So whenever, instead of asking, as I did in the previous example, is engagement related to turnover or associated with voluntary turnover? Here we're actually framing this in a specific direction and saying we are going to test whether engagement is negatively related to voluntary turnover. And to make a hypothesis like this, we typically would have some reason to, perhaps prior research or something we found in our literature search that would cause us to decide to say that we're actually going to go in a direction here and not just ask whether engagement is associated with voluntary turnover in any direction, but specifically is higher levels of engagement associated with more voluntary turnover, or rather less voluntary turnover here. Now, the next example of a hypothesis is turnover intention mediates the relationship between engagement and voluntary turnover. Okay, and so this is a process type of hypothesis where here we're introducing the mediator of turnover intention that is intervening, or at least we're proposing will intervene within the relationship between engagement and voluntary turnover. As the next example, autonomy and task significance negatively predict voluntary turnover. So as before, when I was asking a question about different work characteristics or job characteristics and which ones are going to affect voluntary turnover, in this example with the hypothesis, I'm narrowing it down and I'm saying specifically these two work characteristics or job characteristics, autonomy and task significance, are going to negatively predict or be negatively associated with voluntary turnover. And as the final example, the hypothesis is new employees who participate in the formal onboarding program are less likely to quit during their first 6 months. And so this is a hypothesis that's associated with the one that was more specific, that was asking regarding the question that was asking about new employees and within the first 6 months of employment. And here we're also framing it in terms of an onboarding program as well. Now, in terms of question formulation, it's important to remember that it's often going to be an iterative process. Okay, and so what do I mean by that? Well, question formulation is often an iterative process, which means that answering one question or testing one hypothesis, as shown here, often leads to more questions or more hypotheses. Okay? And so that's a normal thing to expect. Our work is really never done. Usually we need to really think a problem is often not solved once and never paid attention to again. We often have to revisit it as the context around it changes, including key stakeholder expectations, as well as customers and employees or anybody who might be a stakeholder in this process and what they need or want out of this, or even new contextual changes in terms of the business environment that might affect that problem that we're trying to solve. Now, also when we're engaging in question formulation, and this applies both to formulating questions and to generating hypotheses, don't underestimate the role of theory. We can use theory to our advantage. There are voluminous literatures in psychology and the social sciences in general that can help us make sense of human behavior. And these are based often on robust or vast amounts of prior research. So questions are often going to be inspired by either informal or formal theories that are used to understand or explain a topic or phenomenon of interest associated with the problem. So an example that I'll walk through here is the theory of planned behavior, by Asian, and this was really cited by Asian in 1991 as one of the seminal works in which the author and the scientist proposed this theory of planned behavior. So this is a theory that focuses on why do people engage in certain behaviors. And there's many different things we could think about in terms of why do people do what they do, why do they act, why do they behave. But the purpose of a theory is to constrain the boundaries or to add boundaries and to narrow our focus and to provide a simplified view of a phenomenon. And so here, the end goal is behavior. And what this theory suggests is that attitudes about that behavior, norms about performing that behavior, and a person's perception of control over their ability to perform that behavior will influence the behavior, but through this intermediary mechanism of intention, okay? Intention to perform that behavior, okay? And so this is an example of a process type theory here, where we're now looking at how attitudes, norms, and control affect intention, which affects behavior here. So let's work through an example with specific behavior and a specific type of an intention. And specifically, going along with the scenario we've talked about initially in our problem solving and question formulation examples, let's focus on voluntary turnover here. So people who quit the organization. And in terms of a specific type of intention, well, it follows and makes sense that we might focus on turnover intention. And so this is how we can use a theory like this. It gives us these broad categories or constructs or concepts, and then we can narrow it down or apply certain concepts or constructs that are more specific that we think are appropriate and are part of the problem that we're trying to solve and will help us answer the question that we're trying to answer. So let's think of some examples here. So using this theory of planned behavior as a framework, we could then say, well, okay, so what's causing voluntary turnover here? Well, this could help us create a question or formulate a question in which we ask, are poorer attitudes towards work and the organization as a whole associated with greater turnover intention? So looking at this first linkage right here in this theoretical model. Now, this theory might also lead us to ask this or to state this hypothesis, which is greater turnover intention will lead to a higher probability of quitting. And so this explains this link here. And so you can get a feel for how if you find a good theory that's appropriate for your problem and appropriate for the questions you're asking, it can actually help you with formulating those questions about that problem and actually creating hypotheses that will help us solve that problem and understand that problem as well. So now let's move on to these cognitive processes I alluded to previously when we're thinking about this general framework of first adopting a strategic mindset, then defining a problem, then formulating a question. As we're doing this, we should engage in these cognitive processes in which we're thinking divergently and convergently. So what does that mean? Well, both divergent and convergent thought process are important when defining a problem and formulating a question and considering how to define problems and formulate questions that importantly lead to a strategic end or goal. And other ones that will be presumably valuable to the organization. So trying to solve problems and answer questions that if we do so will actually add value, which should really be our end goal here. So divergent thinking is the process of adopting a broadened, imaginative mindset in which many ideas and new possibilities are considered. And this can lead to a large quantity of creative or novel ideas. So one way to get yourself into this mode of divergent thinking is to engage in positive affect or to try to prime yourself to feel joyous or happy, as broaden and build theory by Fredrickson would suggest that this will lead us to this more expansive way of thinking that's more consistent with divergent thinking. Now, in addition, we want to engage in convergent thinking. And this is the process of adopting a critical and evaluative mindset in which various alternatives are judged, and this can lead to a more refined set of high-quality ideas. Interestingly, we could also apply broaden and build theory in this context, but instead think about negative affect or negative emotion. Negative emotions often have this narrowing effect of narrowing our focus. And sometimes this can be really good for activities like proofreading or editing and things like that. But it can also be good for lending a critical and evaluative mindset. I'm not saying we need to walk in being angry, but we might not be as able to engage in convergent thinking effectively if we're in a very joyous and happy mindset. So it's important to think about where you are, or at least to very much put yourself into this frame of thinking. Now, in terms of thinking divergently and convergently, once a strategic mindset is in place, the identification, framing, and defining of the problems should involve the following. First, a phase of ideation with divergent thinking. And what does this mean? Well, this means that an ideation with divergent thinking in which many potential ideas, possibilities, and ultimately problems should be entertained and considered, with a focus on creativity and quantity. So here, even if something seems a little bit outlandish or a lot outlandish in terms of ideas, possibilities, and potential problems to solve, it's okay. Keep those things out in the open and don't try to reduce that list or cull that list just yet. Focus on being creative and focus on generating a lot of ideas here. Now, next or second, we engage in a phase with deliberate convergent thinking. And this means that we're going to engage in deliberate convergent thinking in which the list of potential problems is winnowed to those that will contribute to the most to strategic goals, ends, or initiatives. So this is where we really narrow that large list or that large quantity of ideas, possibilities, and problems that we identified in the first phase and narrow them down to ones that we think are most promising or will have most value, or specifically strategic value. Now, similarly, phases of divergent and convergent thinking should occur when formulating questions. So not just in the problem definition phase, but we should also engage in similar types of thinking when we're trying to initially create a large list of questions we might answer, and then ultimately narrow those down with convergent thinking processes. So what are some examples of the benefits of applying this broad framework of adopting a strategic mindset, defining problems, formulating questions, and thinking divergently and convergently throughout those processes? Well, if we think about the literature search and review process, which we often use to gather evidence about a particular problem or about a question that we're posing, well-articulated and well-informed questions or hypotheses can actually guide the literature search and review process. And they can make it more efficient too. So for example, here's this question we might have formulated. Does engagement predict voluntary turnover? So watch how this question can actually inform and guide us through the literature search and review process. Well, this question implies two variables here, engagement and voluntary turnover. And these are two variables that represent psychological constructs here. A person's level of engagement and their behavior associated with voluntarily quitting or leaving an organization, voluntary turnover. So these give us two targets right here to define and investigate in our literature search and review. These might actually become, and probably will become, the keywords or the search terms that we use during our literature search process, and as well as synonyms that are related to these. So in synonyms being, for example, with voluntary turnover, we might also use keywords or search terms like quitting behavior, withdrawal behavior, and things like that. Now, this question also implies an association we need to investigate too, and see what is known, if anything, about this association. So it's asking, does engagement predict voluntary turnover? So within this question, there's an implied association between engagement and voluntary turnover. So we'd probably want to combine, for example, our search terms or keywords for engagement and voluntary turnover and make sure that whatever we're searching for includes both of those either in the title or the document as a whole. Now, in addition, adding contextual information or boundary conditions to a question can actually, or a hypothesis, can actually aid the literature search and review process as well. And so what do I mean by that? Well, let's return to our example, except now let's augment it a little bit. And so now you'll notice we've got, does engagement predict voluntary turnover for customer service agents? So remember, this gets back to the context that we helped articulate during that initial problem definition, that scenario I provided towards the beginning of this lecture, in which our focal population here is customer service agents and their voluntary turnover. So what will this do? Well, by adding additional boundary conditions or contextual information, we're actually focusing the literature search and review process, because this will likely become an additional search term or keyword we add when we're performing that literature search. So in addition to engagement and voluntary turnover and their synonyms, we'll also probably search for customer service agents as well. Now, in addition, it's going to increase the likelihood that the solutions and recommendations that we generate from our literature search and review process, we're going to increase the likelihood that those solutions will generalize to the population or conditions or the context of interest. In other words, to our specific problem in our organization that we're attempting to solve. Now, in addition to potential benefits on literature search and literature review, there's also benefits for storytelling too, because a well-articulated and a well-informed question or hypothesis can guide interpretation and storytelling. So when we keep the interpretation and storytelling focused on answering the focal question and solving the associated problem, this is going to ensure that the story being told provides answers to the original question that had been posed, okay? Or solutions to the initial problem. And so this is really important to remember. Sometimes it's helpful to actually keep your questions that you formulated or your hypotheses right in front of you as you're trying to craft the narrative for your story, whether it's oral or in writing or some kind of presentation. It's important to make sure you keep it focused. So there are many other examples of benefits that can come out of good problem definition and question formulation, and in general, adopting a strategic mindset throughout that process. And those are just a few that we focused on there that benefit the literature search and review process and storytelling. So to sum up this lecture, we started with defining problems and what that means, and what is a problem to begin with? How do we define that? Then we moved on to, well, how do we go about formulating questions, and what's the value of doing so? And then we talked about, well, what process should we use in terms of when we're thinking about defining problems and formulating questions and generating these ideas, possibilities, and so forth and so on. Well, this is where we apply divergent and convergent cognitive processes, or divergent and convergent thinking. And then finally, we just finished up talking about examples of benefits here. So this wraps up the lecture on defining problems and formulating questions.